Okay, so we're going to be talking about Angular directive scope. So who here is familiar with the directive definition object? It's okay to not raise your hand. Okay, this is also the object that you return when you create a directive. Who here has ever created a custom directive? All right, so the directive definition object is this thing. You say your module.directive and the name of your directive, the function that returns the DDO, the directive definition object. One of those things that you can have on the directive definition object is a scope. And this scope can take a couple different properties or a couple different values. And those values can have a couple different properties. And so we're going to be talking about how you define your directive scope, which in reality is the API to your directive. So it's very, very important if you want to survive. And so, yeah, so first off, yeah, we're just going to jump right in. So if you don't define a scope, so we have this very, very simple directive, this one, no scope. So I'm not defining a scope. In fact, I'm only defining a template for this directive. So it's very, very simple. It is actually inside of itself using a directive called showScope, which is down here, and it's a little bit complicated. You don't need to know how this works to understand things. Just know that this directive will show the properties on the scope of wherever it's used, as well as any properties that it's inherited from its parent or parents. So yeah, there's no scope. I'm not defining a scope on this directive. This is like default behavior if you don't define a scope. And what it looks like is it has its own properties that are the properties of the scope that it's actually being declared on. So here in our app we have a controller called main controller. We're using controller as, and if you're not using controller as, repent. And so we have our main controller, and that is the scope on which our directive is going to be compiled. And so this no-scopes directive scope is the scope of the main controller. Is that like super confusing? It might be, and that's okay. If there's anybody who'd like to chime in with a simpler explanation, be my guest. So yeah, let's take a look really quick at this main controller. That might be helpful. So yes.
Quick, were you saying that the no scope is a non-isolated scope, so it just inherits the parent scope?
So the no scope actually doesn't inherit at all, but it has the exact same scope. Those scopes are identical. Let me demonstrate. So if I open my DevTools, and actually if I go to my Elements tab, let's make this bigger. So if I select this this body element, I can actually ask Angular what the scope of that element is by simply doing angular.element, and then I pass it an element that I want to get the scope for. And actually, pro tip, in your DevTools in Chrome and I believe in Firefox, you can actually do $0, and that represents the element that you have currently, or the node that you have selected. So I can change my selection, $0, and now it's that, and actually $1 is the one you had selected last. So super handy. So let's select the body, and then I say angular.element, and now I get a JQ-Lite version of that node. And if you're using jQuery, then you'll get the jQuery version. That would be like essentially the same as this if you're using jQuery. But because it's an Angular element, I can get the scope from it, and I just call scope on it. And that will give me the scope for the element I have selected. So if I change my selection to be down here, and I say, give me the scope, this one has it's a totally different scope. And we'll look more at that later because it's an isolate scope. But here we have my main controller scope. And if I go to this section where I have scope is undefined, and I go to this no scope directive, and inside of that no scope directive, I say Angular element, so the current element I have selected, $0 scope. And, I'll assign that to a variable, so var the scope equals that. And then I'll go back up here to the body tag, and I'll say the scope is exactly equal to angular.element0.scope. So they are exactly the same scope. That is what scope, like not defining scope, means in the directive definition object. You're just given the exact same scope. And so if you decide you want to be all fancy and you add like a link function, this will take a scope. That scope will be the scope of the main controller. Have I lost anybody? Yeah.
So the default is scope false.
Default is scope undefined. But yes, scope false would accomplish the same thing.
Okay.
Yep, very good. Great. Any other questions? It's okay to interrupt me, by the way. Okay, next concept. We have, oh, and by the way, this has no inherited properties, and that is simply because my main controller is a child of the root scope, and so it actually is not really technically a child of anything. It doesn't have any inherited properties that were set by a parent scope. And I am technically kind of hiding some things from you because if you look at this scope, obviously it's got a bunch of properties on it, but we're not showing you anything with the dollars because that's Angular specific stuff. So yeah, great. So next concept is if you specify scope as true. So we have the scope true directive, and it has the exact same template as above, but I have also defined scope as true. So this alters things just a titch. If I go and look at the output of this, it has no properties on its own. All of its properties are inherited from its parent. So if I go into here and I say here I am on the scope true, I say angular.element, well, yeah, blah, 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 blah. So if I look at the scope of that element and I try to say that's equal to the document.body scope, then that's false. They are different scopes. However, if I say this element scope.parent, $parent, so its parent scope, is actually the body's scope. Right? So now, because I have said scope is true, it creates a new child scope. Does that make sense? Hopefully. So what this gets you is a little bit of protection, but I would never rely on it, and I never use this feature. This I think was used more frequently before, like a while ago, but you never want to rely on scope inheritance. It's just not a really good idea from a maintainability standpoint. So we're going to jump
like
into
accessing parent directly.
Yes, exactly, or even yeah. So accessing parent directly is like you never want to use $parent unless like you're about to die and somebody tells you to. Yeah, you don't want to do that. And then I would recommend against depending on scope inheritance, just because like inside of your directive, unless you're just like a behavioral directive. And the reason for that is that what that means is you can't actually take your directive and reuse it in other places without having to make sure that where you're using that is setting up its scope so that that directive can use those inherited properties. If that didn't make sense, that's okay. Just, yeah, use isolate scope for most things unless it's just like a behavioral directive like ng-click or something. Okay, awesome. So any questions about child scope? Great. Let's go back to code. Now we're going to talk about isolate scope. So if I look here, I'm assigning scope to an object. It's just an empty object. So this object actually does mean something, and you do put stuff in it, and we'll show you what that is in a little bit. But for everything else, it's all exactly the same. But if we look at the output, this scope has none of its own properties and no inherited properties. And that no inherited properties is the key difference, is that it's totally isolated from its parent. And so technically, So if I go scope right here, oh, sorry, I should have mentioned Angular.element $0.scope. So that will get me the scope of the currently selected element that I have in here. And obviously, like, that's not something you do in your code. That's just for console purposes. You can't use $0. That, like, wouldn't make sense. But who here has heard of and uses Batarang? It's an extension for Chrome. Okay, if you don't, you should, and it's actually going to be updated big time really, really soon, and it's going to be awesome, and I'm really excited about it. But what Angular Batarang does, or what Batarang does, is it does actually a lot of things. But one of the cool things it does is it adds this cool, handy little $scope thing right over here, and it will show you the properties of the scope that you have currently selected, which is way awesome. So along with that, it's called Batarang. Yeah.
I thought Batarang was doing what you were doing in console.
Yep, and that's the next thing that it does. Yeah. So it also will do this exact. This is actually the code that it uses to create a variable on your console called $scope. So that's it. They are exactly equivalent. So if you have Batarang installed, you can use $scope, and it's brilliant. So highly recommend that. That is useful information. So yeah. And if you want to learn more about Batarang, I'm an Egghead author, and I have an Egghead lesson on Batarang, so go watch. It's great. Okay, so here we have our isolate scope directive here, and you can see it has a class called ng-isolate scope. So if I say $scope here, this is the isolate scope for this isolate scope directive. I probably shouldn't have called it isolate scope, because now I'm saying that word over and over, but it is.
It's Angular that adds the class, right? You didn't add the
Yes,
class.
that's right. And so if I say $scope.parent, it is actually equal to Angular.element document.body.scope. So it is isolated from its parent in that it doesn't prototypically inherit any of the parent's properties, but it still is tied to its parent because it, technically is a child of its parent. So that's something to be aware of. But yes, again, do not use $parent, please. So yeah, what's really, really nice about isolate scope is it allows you to define your API and ensure that you don't depend on things that you shouldn't be. And this helps big time with reusability. And actually, this is so awesome that the main component in Angular 2, the component thing that you hear about, is basically an isolate scope directive. And so yeah, it's just a really, really good idea. So we're going to look at some of the different properties that you can assign to this scope object definition. Oh, and by the way, just for the fun of it, I'll say controller is a function that takes the scope, and we'll say scope.foo equals bar. Well, that's a bad example because its parent has foo bar. So I don't know, Ken Snyder. Is that how you spell your name? Okay, good. So now it has its own properties, Ken Snyder. Woo! And we all like Ken. Yay! So let's move on to before we move on, does anybody have any questions? Lively crowd. All right. I'm either being really bad at explaining things, or you guys are just getting it, which I hope that's the case. Okay, so now we have @scope directive. So you can have this little attribute type of directive thingy here, and I probably should just say that that's the normal way that you'll normally see it in most stuff. But basically, what this is saying is, hey, Angular, as a directive, when you find the @scope directive, look for the value attribute and bind that to me using the attribute binding. So that might have been a little bit confusing. So before I actually get too far down into these different types of bindings, why don't I show you something that is really awesome? So who knows who Lucas Rubelkey is? Anybody know who Lucas Rubelkey is? Maybe Lucas. I'm sure you guys know who he is because he's He's great and pretty popular in the Angular community. That's Lucas. Anybody know who he is now? Really? Well, he's great. I like Lucas, and he's and hey, that's me. Woo! So yeah, this is a quick infographic that he created to help us all understand what isolate scope is and how the different options for isolate scope work. So first, isolate scope is how you define the perimeter of your directive. So what comes in, what goes out, your API for your directive. Yes, it is great for that. And there are 3 ways to do it: the attribute, binding, or expression. So first, with an attribute, this is one-way direction communication. So you say, hey, I'll let you know when things change, and I as the directive say cool, and this is how it looks. You say scope, the name that I'm going to refer to it internally as myself as the directive is at, and then when you use me, you use the kebab case version of my camel case scope, and you use the curly braces if you want that to change. It will be bound as a string. So it only goes into the directive can't communicate that back out. And that is useful sometimes. And then we have a binding type. And so this is 2-way communication. And so I can say, hey, I've got a local item, and it is 2-way bound. It is interpolated as an Angular expression, so it's basically exactly what you would put inside of the curly brackets, but you don't have to do it because it is a 2-way bound thing. And then if I update it internally as the directive, it will be updated for you as well. And that is the 2-way binding there. And then as an expression, so the directive can say, hey, I don't care what you have to say, I'm going to tell you when something happens. And so that's with an ampersand. Don't ask me why. And then the local expression will just be some statement that is invoked when I call it internally. So that's how like ng-click works. So if this is all very confusing to you, I have good news. Angular 2 is coming, and it will solve all of your confusion problems because this is a very complicated API. It makes sense once you start using it and you get used to it, but it is not the most fun API to deal with, to be totally honest. And like the @ symbol sort of makes sense. It's an attribute, and the equal sort of makes sense. Like these things equal each other, and then the ampersand is like, I don't know, ampersand. And so yeah, it's kind of wonky. But yeah, let's go back and I will show you how it works in actually working. So
and there's some tricks there with like, if you try to reassign the value, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
yeah, like you've really got to understand how these bindings, these different types of bindings work, because yeah, if you don't, it can be really difficult to debug. And yeah, there's a big black box standing between you and the DOM and your model, which sometimes is not fun. Most times is not fun if you have problems. So, okay, so we do have an attribute binding here, and we'll go back at this infographic really quick. So for an attribute binding, you have the local name, and that is how you refer to it locally in the directive. And then when somebody wants to use your directive, they use the kebab case version of your camel case local name. So here it's local-name, and that's kebab case because it's like a shish kebab. So you can also rename your what you want this attribute to be. So you see how they're exactly the same. You can actually rename it by specifying a string after the @. So if instead of the value as kebab case, I wanted people to say angular.element, no, never mind. What was, I lost it. Oh man, now it's gone for life. Here, copy less. It is, nope, that's not it either. Dang it. What did I call it? @scope value. So if I wanted people to use @scope value kebab case, that's how I would do it. And that's what I want to do because that's how I'm using it right now. So here you can see I'm using the @scope directive, and then I'm passing this attribute as like a curly brace value, and this is being interpolated and passed to my directive as a string. And so if we look at the result here, here we have the outer controller where we have this input here, and this is on the main controller, and then we have this inner directive, and inside of the directive it has another input where it is using or passing the value to my input. So the value being sort of kind of bound to the @scope value that I'm passing. Does that all make sense, how that's all wired up? So let's see what actually happens. So if I say, hello AngularJS Utah, that's awesome, two-way binding, way cool, but not really. So this is where, like, if you wanted to accomplish something like this where they're both updating each other, is not what you want to do, because that @scope the binding is not going to bind back up. So does that make sense? Yes, Kent, thank you. So it's one way. Okay, so with the equal sign, we have basically the same thing, but slightly different. We have this directive called equal scope, and I've renamed it to equal scope value, so that's how people are going to use it. They kebab case that in their attribute, and then I refer to it as the value inside of my template and in my controller and my link function, and so it's basically the same thing. And then when I use it, instead of doing the curly braces, it's actually binding to an expression, and so now these two values are totally bound, and this is actually how ngModel works. Fancy that. So if I go back into here, into my scope with the equals, I can say, yay, seriously. So now they're bound both ways, and it's magic. Woo! And this is what caught us all when we started Angular, like, oh my gosh. Yeah, cool stuff. So at least that's what caught me. I was like, what? That's wild. So any questions about the equals sign, how that works? Okay. Great. You can also make it optional with a question mark. You don't need to do that for the @sign, but you do sometimes for the equals if you want it to be optional. So, okay, and then ampersand. So this one I actually didn't finish building, so I'll build it with you really quick. This is dangerous. So instead of the value, I'm what is being given to me as the directive author is not a value, but a function that I can invoke to tell the to tell my parent scope, hey, something happened. So it's like an event, like ngClick, for example. So if we look again, it is with an expression. You pass it out. You have the ampersand here, and it's actually the technical term is not expression, but statement. So it's like a sort of almost JavaScript statement. And so here, instead of an input, I'm going to have a button. Whoa. And I'll say, I don't know, ngClick. Well, that like really throws things off. Well, yeah, I'll just say vm.call or thing. Yep, we'll call the thing and call thing. And then inside of my controller, I'm using controller as, so I'm going to say var vm equals this, and then vm dot call thing equals call thing, which I will define down here. And if you're like, why is he doing that? Why is he not inlining it? Then I will direct you to a blog post later about why this is a good idea. Okay, so we'll alert with, or no, we won't alert here. We will actually just call this update value thing. So I'll say vm.update value. We'll call it, and then inside of my index where I am using this on update on value update, I'm going to say vm dot, I don't know, ampersand scope thing equals hello. There we go. I hope that works.
You know, family member named Amber.
Amber? No. How do you spell ampersand? Ampersand? Oh, thank you.
He was an inside joke. It was pretty funny.
Well, yes, I do, actually. Well, now I'm not going to rename it. It is ampersand. How embarrassing. Okay, so let's see. Oh, and instead of equal scope, this is going to be ampersand scope. How embarrassing. Okay.
Oh, you forgot the M.
Ampersand. Thank you. Call thing. Wow. Yeah, so we'll call the thing, and boom, my model gets set to hello. So did that sort of make sense? I'm sorry that I kind of ran out of time last minute to actually finish that example. Yeah, that's how the ampersand scope works. Is you give it a statement that you want called when the directive calls this function that you're passing to it, or statement, yeah, when you want it to do that. That's how ngClick works. So any other questions about that? Okay, so there are a couple other creative ways to communicate with a directive that I will show you, and these are not things that you will do often, but they are pretty handy at times. So I will demonstrate for you quickly. So we have this function template. Who here knew that you could pass a function to as your template property in your DDO? Fancy that. It's actually super helpful in some cases. Anybody heard of Angular formally before? Sweet. Wow, actually, I wrote Angular formally. And Angular formally uses the template as a function to give you like tons of power over how the formally formed directive is works with the template. So pretty handy. And what we're doing here is you're past the original element and the original attributes before anything is compiled. So this is like one of the very first things that happen when Angular says, oh, hey, I found a function template directive. Let me go get the template for that. This is what they do. And so they pass you the original element and the original attributes. And then here, I can take those attributes and get the awesome thing attribute and then just put is super awesome. And so if I go to my index here, and I have this input with an ng model on awesome thing, and then I pass that awesome thing into here, then I can have sweet two-way binding. And, well, yeah, sort of, kind of, yeah. But it's being bound to that directive, which is pretty darn handy. But you need to be aware of something. So if I were to console log the adders dot awesome thing, and I refresh and look at my console, it actually is the exact binding syntax. So if you were to suddenly decide, hey, I want to have an isolate scope on this because I'm so wise, then this is totally going to bork you and nothing is going to work. And the reason for that is now this template is actually, because it resolves to just like whatever I pass it, so it basically resolves to this, then it's going to look for VM awesome thing on myself as the directive, and this directive doesn't have a VM awesome thing, and so yeah, that's just scope scariness that you need to be aware of when doing crazy things like this. So, any questions about that? Okay, awesome. So the next thing is attr parse, and I haven't tested this one yet, so hopefully it works. But we're going to make a new section with an HR that has an H3 attr parse, and this one is going to be attrs parse? Yeah, attr parse, and this one will we pass it the attr as an attribute. So we'll say the attr equals, and it's expecting an expression, an expression. So we'll say vm.awesomeThing. So we'll just reuse this guy, and it is initialized to JavaScript. So because it is an awesome thing. So if we go and save that and go down here, you see under attr parse we see JavaScript, and just to make things my favorite, there we go. My favorite JavaScript. So let me explain how this is actually working. So you can use the parse service, which is actually the service that Angular uses internally to parse expressions. And so that's how you can do almost almost JavaScript things inside of your Angular templates in your curly braces. You can't do like alert or console log or anything in those, but you can like sort of invoke functions and do different things. It's using the parse service to do that, and so then we parse this, and then we compile this. Well, we don't really compile. We invoke the parsed expression on the scope that we have. And because I'm not defining any scope here, the scope is actually the main controller scope. And so it's able to parse whatever I pass to it as an expression that is evaluated on the main controller scope. And that's why when I say VM awesome thing, it's actually looking for VM awesome thing on the main controller and not on myself. So hopefully that makes sense. But then there's actually another way to accomplish this. You can use scope eval. And scope $eval is not evil. It is awesome, and you don't use it often, but it is kind of fun. And that essentially is very much the same thing. I haven't looked in the internals, but I imagine it's like probably using the parse service and invoking that with the scope. So we could look at the internals, except the internals are yeah, ha! Check that out. That's exactly what it's doing. Neato. Okay, so that's basically the same thing, and so then you don't have to inject $parse, which is fun. And then finally, if you want to actually watch it, then you can just do a regular scope watch. You pass the attribute that you're given, and then it's just a regular watch from there. And so the scope watch, it is actually basically doing the same thing as eval every time it watches. So we could accomplish this same thing by providing a function that returns that. They're roughly equivalent. So awesome. Does anybody have any? Oh, and then now because we are watching it here, if I update JavaScript here, then like it's bound like that. But if I wasn't watching it like this, then I'm toast. So magic. Okay, cool. So I don't even know how much time I have left. When am I supposed to be done? Probably like 5 minutes ago.
No, keep going.
Okay, I think this is probably the last one. I don't have any more, so yes. So we'll give this a label, observed. Okay, so we have this attr observe. So who's seen the $observe on the attrs object? It's pretty handy. Basically, it solves this problem. So if I were in here on this attr parse that we had just before, if I were to instead of awesome thing do like, I don't know, foo plus vm.awesome thing, then I would be toast, because this watch will have this passed to it, foo JavaScript. And foo JavaScript is not something that this scope can watch. Well, it can watch it, but it's not actually an expression that means anything to this scope. And so the attrs observe solves that problem if you want, for some reason, to do this curly brace stuff. So let's put that back as it was. Actually, we'll copy and paste this. And then, well, actually, we'll undo. And then we'll put that there. And this is, attrs observe. And we'll do attr observe. I think that's what I called it. Yeah. Okay, so basically it is going to observe the observe attribute, and so we're going to, instead of the attr, we'll say observe. I'm going to add a space there. And now we can see that it says observed is foo JavaScript. Happiness, yay! So that is something that is kind of handy sometimes. So hopefully that makes sense. Does anybody have questions? It's very similar to a watch, but it's not exactly like a watch. It basically will just take an attribute that it doesn't actually necessarily have to have curly braces around it. It basically just watches the value of that attribute. And as that attribute updates, if we can look here, we see observe equals this crazy long weird string. As that value updates, then Angular will be like, oh, hey, I am going to update the value on my scope. So, does that yeah, I think that's it. Does anybody have any questions about anything related to scope and directives and stuff? Yeah.
I read about in 1.4 they changed that they added some stuff to find the controller.
Yeah, I was glad you mentioned that, actually. I was going to mention that.
Yeah, you teased us about 1.4 earlier. You got to show us some of that.
Yeah, so 1.4 is really cool, and it was officially released yesterday. Hallelujah! And we started upgrading our app today, and it is not free. But it, yeah, one of the cool things that comes with 1.4, and I'm actually running 1.4 right now. Let me make sure, but angular.version, yep, 1.4. So in here I have this awesome equals scope, and I have this controller, and I'm using bind to controller and controller as. So blow your mind. You need to, well, you don't have to do this, but you can do this. That is basically exactly the same. So I am not 100% sure why this is so awesome. I'll be honest. So maybe there's some additional stuff I need to look at, but I have looked at some things. Actually, let's do a quick test and see if you need that scope. I'm pretty sure that you do. So if I go to my equals, yeah. You still need to specify you have an isolate scope by giving it an empty object. So yeah, I'm not sure why this is useful. So yeah, if you want to use it, use it. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, good question. Blah, blah, blah. Yep. I'm not sure why that is cool. I will probably, well, unless I'm convinced otherwise, I will probably not be using this. I will probably continue to use just true. So.
What does the true do again?
It basically, so, oh, good question. So in a in a normal world, or in a previous life, this is what your directives would look like. And you would inject scope, and you'd say scope.the_value, and we'll actually we'll variable log that. And if we look in here, then we see the scope value is undefined, right? Because we don't actually pass it anything initialized. So in the normal world, or in the previous life, that was true. But then they introduced controller as. And this is an awesome thing for many different reasons, which I will not explain right now, but I highly recommend that you do this. And by the way, if you're curious, VM stands for view model. I do that on all of my stuff so that I never have to remember what did I call this controller. So everything is VM for me. And then inside of your controller, because you are doing this, you can say var VM equals this. And actually, you don't have to say var VM, but I like to do that to keep my template and my controller in sync, so I can see, oh, VM there, and when I say VM the value equals foo, and I see VM, it just makes sense. And then we refresh, and we're like, foo, hooray!
So
And
it might do good to spend like another minute on what that actually means for those that aren't familiar, because all of the Angular tutorials online are old and outdated, and none of them use the controller as syntax, except for probably yours.
yeah,
John Pop style guide recommends it though.
yeah, John Papa does.
I know that.
But you're right. Yeah, lots of the old tutorials use $scope because that's all that you had back in 1.2. So in 1.3 they introduced controller as because
Actually, 1.2, it was just experimental, right?
I don't recall. Maybe you're right. I could be wrong.
Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, actually, you know what? I think you are right. I think it was in 1.2.
Because I started using it when they announced that it would be stable in 1.3. I started using it in 1.2.
Yeah, and it's a great idea. So because of scope inheritance, right here, when I say scope true, I now have a child version of this thing. And if I were to, actually Justin and I had a problem like this today. This is awful. But I set a value, if I set a value on myself that's a primitive value, then I'm going to override anything that my parent has. And it's just because of the way JavaScript works. Yes.
If you had something that was called, say, for example, I don't know, submit in one of your controllers, and let's say that was nested inside of a child, because that would never happen, then when you write submit onto your scope, it actually will propagate through any scope, and the controller as makes it so that whatever you call that variable, it won't leak into parent or child scopes. except for in ways that are expected and normal.
Yeah, it just makes your stuff a lot more predictable, and so it's a good idea. And if you want more information on it, Dave Smith, who is not here, loser. Oh, he's not a loser. I like Dave, and I miss him. But he gave a terrific talk at NGNL, Angular Conference in Amsterdam, about all of the terrible mistakes he made when starting out with Angular. And one of those was binding to primitives and using ng-controller. And he explains why this is a problem, like in the computer science-y way that actually makes a lot of sense. So back to the bind to controller question. So we have this controller as, and it solves some problems, and it's really great. But the problem is that the value is still bound to $scope. And so when I say vm.thevalue equals foo, you'll notice that it actually isn't updating my outer controller, because my outer controller is actually referencing the scope's foo, not the VM's foo. And so if I simply say bind to controller is true, then it actually binds all of these scope properties to my instance of the controller. So yeah, this is a constructor function. That's why I use this. And it will bind the value to this, which I assign to VM, and voila, magic.
It still passes in that $scope. But
Yep, you can still pass in $scope. And funny thing is, if you look at $scope, then you can find VM is right there. So you can, and that's kind of how this magic works right here, is because it's actually just a property on the scope.
Since I started using the controller as method, I've never really found a compelling reason to inject scope.
Yeah, most of the time you won't. The only time that you really do is if you want to call a digest or if you want to watch something. But yeah, most of the time you won't be injecting $scope. So funny, fancy stuff. And oh, there was one other thing that I wanted to mention, unless anybody else has any other questions. Yes?
So back to the binding controller, in your example that you have up right there, if you had two properties on scope,
Like here?
like say foo or something, if you put an object to bind the controller, only the ones that were specified in bind the controller would be available in the template.
Oh, you mean like right here?
Right, you just put foo in there.
So if I had like two that were different or the same?
Value, only foo would be available in your template.
Is that, do you know that, or are you asking
No,
that?
I know that.
Oh. So if you use both the scope as an object and the bind to controller as an object?
Right.
Hmm.
Then it lets you bind the value, use it in your code, but it's not in the template.
Oh, is that why it's valuable?
That's what the part
Interesting. I'm still not totally convinced, but actually, maybe that does make some sense. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. So, if I understand correctly, anything that you have in scope here would be available inside of your template, but anything inside of your bind to controller would only be available inside of your controller. That doesn't make sense to me. I will have to look at that, but that's what is being said. So, neato. Okay, so any other questions? I had one other thing I wanted to show. Okay, so this is only sort of kind of related to directive scope, but this is important to me, so I'm going to show you anyway. So I recently wrote an article called Newspaper Code Structure, and this is alluding to that this VM is this, and then VM call thing, and then the call thing being defined there. Like, that's crazy verbose. Why don't I just put that right there? And then, heck, I don't even need to name this anymore, and blah, 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 right? And even like this, and then, oh, wait, no, can't do that. Whoa. Yeah, that's why I don't use this. So anyway, the reason that I like to do things this way, and I highly recommend it, is I call this the newspaper code structure. And actually, to take it a step further, I would even say ampersand scope controller with a B, and then I would put that right here and put this right there, and voila. So the reason that I feel like this is valuable is because of this. So let's pretend that you're coming into a project and somebody says, hey, I need you to maintain that file. You need to add something to it. So one of the first things that you need to do is find out what is available in this file. What are the functions available? What are the different properties? And if you're using ES6, which you all should, then you'll have this sweet export thing. So you're like, oh, okay, so this is a module that I can export stuff from. And so what is my API into this module? So you'll look for all these export statements and you'll be like, okay, so I have a constant bar and it has a sum and a sum function, and you got to keep scrolling to find all the things. And oh wait, I think I missed something, long function, okay, yeah. And that is a problem. So a better approach is you have one export here, and you know exactly what is available in this module. So you're like, okay, so I've got a bar, a long function, a me too, and there's a better way. And here are a couple of things that, or some initialization that needs to happen before you do those exports. And so then I can get bar, and I can see, oh, bar has these things available on it, and I don't have to do any scrolling at all. And if I'm interested in what those things, excuse me, in what those things actually are, then I can just go in here and say, okay, let me find long function, or use my IDE to find it. And I'm searching for it because I care about it, not because I'm looking for something else. So that's the newspaper code structure concept, and it is a real thing. I had to maintain a 2,000 line long file. That was really, like, first off, that's a bad idea. Don't do that. But it happens, and so if it were with newspaper code structure, then it would actually be a lot easier to maintain. So anyway, I wrote a response to my own article that describes newspaper code structure for Angular, and it's basically the same thing what I demonstrated to you. But yeah, the whole concept of newspaper code structure is detail, or important stuff at top, details on bottom, and then your code is a lot easier to grok. Like, you know exactly what this the API to this directive is, and what this directive looks like. And if your ampersand controller, if we were to put this back, was like crazy long, and you had a bunch of functions in it that were long, and this isn't even crazy long, then all of a sudden you decide, oh, I'm going to add a link function. Now somebody coming into your file will look at this and be like, oh, okay, I've got a template, scope, controller, as, bind to controller, and a controller. Okay, great. But no, you actually also have a link function. You don't know that. And what would be even worse is if you decided for some crazy reason to stick these down here. And then you're like, what on earth? So anyway, that's newspaper code structure. That was sort of a lightning talk as part of my talk. I'm sorry. If,
No, that was great.
so.
I didn't know there was something for that.
Oh, I think I made it up. I don't know. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I heard it from somewhere. But yeah, that's what I call it.
Well, it makes sense. You've got your headline, you've got your eye-catching description, and then you've got the meat.
Yep. And I like meat.
I bet there's if anybody's an English major, they probably have it.
Yeah, probably. So anyway, that is my talk and a half. Thank you for being patient with me and letting me ramble.